For the project, I chose African Padauk. I've used it in other projects before, cutting boards. It's a beautiful hardwood. It's kind of like that clay color. But to get started, I just needed to cut down the raw pieces, if you will. And so here I am cutting off a good section of that Padauk. If I ever do resawing again, it'll be probably with the bandsaw, because that is a workout right there. And then obviously the cleanup after that with the hand plane. It's tedious, but I kind of enjoy doing this, so it goes by quick. So then some problems I've had with African Padauk is it does tend to bind up. Even with this robe saw, it binds up too. And then I got to just square up the edge on this one. So once I've got all those surfaces planed and the saw marks taken care of, I can not have to worry about the rest of the squaring up and just go ahead and rip the boards. This was a challenge right here. These small maple pieces, very thin, challenged my hand sawing skills. So once I got those cut, I started gluing them up. This was the header, so just put it together, get a lot of good glue in there, cinch the clamps down tight, and then I get to move on to the next project while that's drying. Once it was done, I wanted to get some rough measurements, just kind of like sampling, make sure that things will fit where they're supposed to, make sure that things get centered the way that they are supposed to, the horizontal slats. Getting those centered perfectly is definitely a challenge. And then on the header, I wanted to go for a unique design. Cooper asked for me to just go ahead and make whatever I wanted for a design, so I cut these little triangle, almost like a lightning bolt pattern out of it. And then I printed out some pictures. Obviously this here is a Jiu-Jitsu kicker, and so I ended up cutting those out along with Cooper's name, which will end up going on the header. So I took those and traced them out, the name obviously Cooper and the kicker on some poplar that has a great grayish streak that goes through it, and it's easier to cut too. Especially with the fret saw, I prefer it over a scroll saw. I seem to get a lot of tear out on the back of, especially like a softer of the hardwoods like poplar itself. But the fret saw seems to cut much smoother. You can choose different blades to do it, but the one blade that I did use here cut very well, and I like the accuracy and the result that it gave me all the way through all the cutting that I did with it. So I wanted to make sure I got a decent look at how this was going to get organized, and so these pieces that I'd finished cutting, there was a little bit of cleanup that was involved, so I filed that smooth using different types of files, and then I moved on to the gluing of the horizontal slats. So I made a couple 2-inch spacer blocks, and what those do then is they equally separate each slat that I put on to the vertical slats, and I just kind of just smoothed out the glue a little bit. You notice I put some green painter's tape down at the bottom of those 2-inch blocks. That helps to make sure that the glue doesn't glue down the spacer blocks themselves. So just place that on there and right up against the 2-inch blocks, and I built that jig there to help guide where I was going to place these slats, and it worked out really well. I suggest using jigs whenever you get the chance. It makes your job much easier if you take the time to make something that fits your job to make it a lot easier for you. Then I moved on to the cinches. I wasn't looking to make anything really difficult, but I chose Purple Heart. It's a beautiful colored wood. I wanted to make these cinches that are going to draw up with some leather. They're going to draw and hold the belt in place. So I wasn't looking for anything exact really. I did make some marks you'll see on the Purple Heart boards, but I went ahead and filed them the most I could right away before I cut them into blocks. It's easier to sand that way. I think I sanded them down to about 220 if I'm not mistaken, and I didn't intentionally make them anything exact because I wanted them to look like they were naturally handmade, and which they are. And sometimes you go for precision, and sometimes you just don't worry about it because you want the look. And so I sanded these down, as you see. I made another jig. Once I had cut the slats, I realized that I did not cut them uniformly. So I used that jig and I redid the pattern so that once I cut all these, they're all going to be to the same size. Unfortunately, when I did that, because I had already glued them on, I ended up cutting right into that. And I also got some tear out, which broke off a tip on one of them. So I was able to find that piece and then glue it back on, and just use some tape to put it back on there. And then I made some marks so I knew exactly where the wood glue needed to go for the header, that is. So when I do pinch it down, I don't really get a whole lot of squeeze out. Sometimes it's difficult to get all that squeeze out, especially if it's in between. So like once this header is placed here, if I was to squish it down and a lot of squeeze out came out, you would have a lot of glue to clean up. And then I made that little block there. I think it was about 3 inches, and that's just to help make sure that I have it going the same way on both sides, so it's evened out. It's just another little tool as a jig to make sure I got the spacing right. And as long as it's flush on the end there, as you see, and it meets that 3-inch block, we're good to go. So I'm just got to clamp it down. And then once I finished that up, I wanted to use some dowels, not just for aesthetics, but also for structural integrity. Dowels will help secure that, because when I put them through, it'll be something that just expands inside both pieces, the horizontal and the vertical slats. And marking these is very critical, because if they don't line up right, you'll end up having holes that are misaligned, and you can easily see that. So drilling these, I really took my time on them and made sure that I lined them up as best I could. The next step was to get the length of the dowels as close as I could to the depth, if you would, of the horizontal and the vertical slats. So I just used a scrap piece of maple, and I drew that out. It came to about 1 inch. So I used my my dovetail Ryobi saw, Japanese saw I should say, and you see how quickly that makes of the work, and it makes a really sharp, smooth cut every time. I put the green tape on so that once the dowels that I'm positioning here, as you see, when I go to cut them off with a flush trim saw, they don't scar up the wood with the sawtooth marks. And here I am cutting off those the dowels, at least the dowels that stuck up high, and you can see how much it marred that tape. And then I just took some 180 grit sandpaper, and I just sanded them flush with the top of the slat themselves, and came out really nice. It came out so nice, in fact, that this is that tip that I had broken off, and you can see, you can't even see it anymore. It just blended right in perfectly. I finished it off with some 220, and I took care of all the really sharp edges while I was at it. Made it nice and smooth. Now here's something. You take some denatured alcohol, and it gives you kind of benefit of two things. One, it shows you how your project is kind of like a glimpse on how it's going to look when it's done. And so I clean up the wood just using that. Look at that come out beautiful. It also shows you if you have any glue that's left over. So it's got a couple benefits to it. To secure the poplar, I decided to use some Gorilla heavy duty adhesive. It says to spray it on both surfaces for the best results, but so Coop, I'm only going to spray these poplar wood pieces that go on the header. My fear is that any extra adhesive that's on the poplar, the Padauk, when I go to apply the polyurethane coating, I'm worried that it may not look right. So we're going to take a chance and just do the pieces instead of the maximum strength. We'll be all right. I make a test spray here to make sure it gives a nice even coating. And then for all the pieces that are going to be glued, I'm going to make a nice coating on the back side of them and make sure that they'll adhere well. The nice thing about the Gorilla Glue is that it gives you a good amount of time to position whatever it is that you're trying to adhere to another object. And here, since I had broken the letters during the sawing, it gave me time to position them. And there's actually 4 different components to that word, Cooper, that I had to reposition several times over until I got it right. And then I just weighted it down. Oh, hi, Merry Christmas. Didn't see you there. What do you think, Coop? You like it? I think it turned out really well. The cinches worked great. These held, like I told you they would. So I think it's ready to go out. I just got to find a box for it. Anyway, Merry Christmas.